In 2018, off the coast of Canada, a mother orca named Tahlequah gave birth to a calf. The calf died within 30 minutes. For the next 17 days, Tahlequah pushed her dead calf through the ocean, over 1,000 miles. Every time the body slipped beneath the surface, she dove down, retrieved it, and pushed it back up into the light. She wouldn't let it sink. No one taught her to do that. There was no ritual passed down, no elder orca explaining what grief should look like. And yet, across the animal kingdom, something eerily similar keeps happening. Animals gathering around their dead, refusing to leave, touching the bodies of the ones they lost, behaving in ways that look, unmistakably, like mourning. Elephants have been filmed standing in silence over a skeleton for hours. Crows gather in circles around a fallen member of their flock, in gatherings scientists now genuinely call funerals. A magpie in Australia was once seen bringing grass and laying it beside the body of another magpie again and again as if trying to build something. None of these species have language, and none of them can sit down and tell a researcher what they're feeling inside. So here's the real question, the one that took science over a century to take seriously. What are they actually doing? Is there anything really happening inside them? Or are we just seeing our own grief reflected back at us in animals that feel nothing at all? The mystery. For most of scientific history, the official answer was simple, and it was final. They're not doing anything. Animals don't understand death. What looks like mourning is just instinct, misfiring, nothing more than biology going through motions it doesn't understand. This wasn't a fringe opinion. For most of the 20th century, it was the mainstream scientific position. Attributing feelings to animals was treated almost like a professional embarrassment, something a serious researcher simply didn't do. But the more scientists actually watched in the field, for years at a time, the harder that clean answer became to defend. Elephants have been seen standing over the bones of dead herd members for hours, running their trunks along the skull, the tusks, in complete silence, sometimes returning to the exact same spot days or even years later. Crows gather in what researchers now genuinely call funerals, circling a dead crow on the ground for 20 minutes or more, calling loudly, before dispersing and avoiding that location for days afterward. Chimpanzees have been filmed cleaning the teeth of a dead companion, brushing dirt from the fur, as if grooming a body that will never move again. Giraffes have been observed standing guard over a dead calf for as long as 4 days, occasionally nudging it, refusing to move on with the herd. None of these species can explain what they're feeling. So how do you even study something like grief in a creature that can't tell you in words that it's grieving? How do you prove an inner experience exists using only what you can see from the outside? That question sent scientists down a much stranger path than anyone expected, and it didn't just change how we see animals, it started changing how we define death and grief and even consciousness itself. Background. Here's the part most people don't know. Comparative thanatology, the scientific study of death-related behavior across species, is barely 20 years old as a serious, funded field of research. Before that, it barely existed at all. Scientific culture in the 20th century leaned heavily on a principle called behaviorism, the idea that you should only study what an animal does, never guess at what it might be feeling. Emotion was considered untestable, and therefore unscientific. For a long time, that meant an entire category of animal behavior, the strange, repeated, often heartbreaking things animals do around their dead, simply went unstudied. Researchers saw it happen. They mostly didn't write about it because there was no respectable way to interpret it. Attributing emotions to animals was seen as a kind of contamination, anthropomorphism, projecting distinctly human feelings onto creatures that might not have anything like them at all. A scientist who suggested an elephant might be sad risked being seen as sentimental rather than rigorous. But field researchers kept encountering behavior that was very hard to file away as meaningless. So, slowly, a new generation of scientists built a framework that could test grief without ever having to ask an animal how it felt. Instead of asking, is this animal sad? They started asking something far more testable. Does this animal change its behavior specifically because of a death, in ways that go beyond ordinary curiosity, that last longer than a passing glance, and that are specific to individuals it actually knew? That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Curiosity about a strange object fades in seconds. What researchers started documenting instead was behavior that persisted for days, that targeted specific bodies over others, and that changed how the surviving animals behaved afterward. That's the key that unlocked everything that came next. Main story. Start with the simplest case on the entire spectrum: ants. When an ant dies inside a colony, its body begins releasing a chemical compound called oleic acid as it decomposes. Within hours, other worker ants pick up the corpse and carry it out of the nest entirely, depositing it in a designated graveyard pile a set distance away from the colony's living space. At first glance, that looks almost like a burial ritual, a coordinated, purposeful response to death. But scientists ran a test in the 1950s that changed the picture completely, and it's still one of the cleanest experiments in this entire field. Researchers painted oleic acid directly onto a living, healthy ant. The other worker ants picked it up, while it struggled, while it was clearly still alive and moving, and carried it out to the graveyard pile anyway, dumping it there regardless of its protests. The ants weren't reacting to death at all. They were reacting to a single chemical signal. No death has to occur for the behavior to trigger, and death occurring without the chemical doesn't trigger it either. The behavior is completely real and completely automatic, a hygiene response built to keep disease out of a colony that might contain thousands of tightly packed individuals. There's no grief here. There doesn't need to be any awareness at all. End of the spectrum. And for a long time, many scientists assumed almost every animal death behavior would eventually reduce down to something equally mechanical, if you looked closely enough. But then, something surprising started happening the further up the ladder of social complexity researchers looked. Take elephants. In the 2000s, researcher Karen McComb and her team ran a now famous field experiment in Kenya. They placed elephant skulls, along with skulls from other large animals like buffalo and rhino, and separately plain pieces of wood directly in the paths that wild elephant herds regularly use to travel. Then they watched what happened when the herds encountered each object. The elephants almost completely ignored the wood. They gave only brief attention to the skulls of other species. But when they came across elephant skulls or pieces of ivory, everything about their behavior changed. They slowed their pace. They approached cautiously. They touched the bones gently and repeatedly with their trunks and the soles of their feet, the exact same gentle touching motion elephants use to greet and comfort living herd members. Some individual elephants returned to investigate the very same skull on separate days, weeks apart. That's not a chemical trigger. And it's not simple curiosity about a novel object either, because novel objects, like the wood, didn't produce anything close to the same reaction. The response was specific to their own species' remains, and it echoed touch patterns elephants use exclusively with living family members. Something about death, or at least about the death of their own kind, was registering very differently inside them than an ordinary unfamiliar object would. And elephant researchers have documented something even stranger over the decades, cases where a herd matriarch dies, and for days afterward, other members of the family group become visibly more cautious, sticking closer together, sometimes staying near the body far longer than would make sense for pure protection from predators. In several recorded cases, herds have covered a dead elephant's body with branches and dirt. Behavior researchers have started referring to, carefully, as something resembling burial. Researchers pushed even further outward. What about grief that unfolds not in a single afternoon, but over time, grief that looks less like an instinctive reflex and more like an ongoing emotional state? That's where the story of Tahlequah becomes so important. Killer whales are matrilineal. They live in tight, lifelong family pods built around mothers and grandmothers, and individuals can stay together with the same family for their entire lives, which for orcas can stretch past 60 years. Sons never leave their mother's pods, even as adults. These are, by any biological measure, some of the deepest and longest social bonds found anywhere in the animal kingdom. When Tahlequah's calf died, she didn't just react for a moment and move on. She carried the small body on her head and back, diving to retrieve it each time it slipped beneath the waves, for 17 straight days, covering more than 1,000 miles of open ocean, all while the rest of her pod stayed close. And at times, other females took turns helping her carry the weight so she could rest and feed. Marine biologists who had tracked this specific pod known as J-pod for decades had genuinely never documented behavior on this scale before. And it raised an uncomfortable question for anyone still clinging to the old idea that this was purely reflexive instinct. Reflexes don't usually last 17 days and 1,000 miles. Something about that explanation stopped fitting. But even this had a serious complication. And to their credit, skeptical researchers pushed back hard. Maybe this wasn't grief in any emotional sense at all. Maybe it was simple confusion. Maybe some highly social animals simply fail to recognize that death has actually occurred, and what looks like devoted mourning is really just an animal stuck waiting for a response, a call, a movement that will never come because it hasn't yet processed that the individual is gone for good. That objection sent scientists looking for a case that could cleanly separate confusion from something closer to actual understanding. A case where the animal's behavior clearly showed they knew the death was permanent, not just that something was temporarily wrong. They found exactly that in chimpanzees. In 2010, researchers at a chimp sanctuary in Scotland filmed the final hours of an elderly female chimpanzee named Pansy, who was dying of natural causes surrounded by her long-term social group. As she grew weaker over her final day, the other chimps around her grew unusually quiet. They groomed her gently again and again, staying physically close in a way that broke from their normal patterns, and in the exact moment she died, the group fell almost completely silent, an extraordinary contrast to the noise, calling, and constant activity that normally fills a chimp enclosure throughout the day. What happened in the days afterward was the detail that mattered most to researchers. The chimps didn't simply sit beside the body indefinitely waiting for a response the way confusion alone might predict. Instead, they cleaned straw and debris from Pansy's fur in what looked like a final act of grooming. Several members of the group avoided the exact spot where she died for days afterward, even though that same patch of the enclosure was normally used constantly, without any hesitation under ordinary circumstances. One younger chimp, her adult daughter, stayed beside the body far longer than the rest of the group, and was later observed showing signs of distress and reduced activity for an extended period afterward, a pattern that in humans would be described without much hesitation as grief. That's not confusion. Confusion doesn't reroute an entire group's daily movement patterns around one specific location for days. That's behavior that changes because the death is understood, on some level, as permanent. Even if chimpanzees have no words and no concept resembling our word for what permanent actually means. And chimpanzees weren't an isolated case. Researchers studying wild chimp communities in Zambia and Guinea have separately documented mothers carrying the mummified remains of dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, continuing to groom and carry the body long after it had visibly begun to decompose, behavior that gradually declined over time in a pattern that looked less like confusion and more like a slow, reluctant process of letting go. The twist. Here's where the story bends in a direction most people, including most researchers early on, didn't expect. The deeper scientists dug, the clearer it became that the real dividing line in the animal kingdom isn't simply between species that grieve and species that don't. It's between species that live inside long-term, complex social bonds, where an individual's death actually disrupts the group's daily survival, its feeding patterns, its protection from predators, its decision-making about where to travel next, and species that live largely independent lives, where one individual's death changes almost nothing for the others around it. Grief-like behavior, in other words, isn't some magical, uniquely human trait sitting apart from biology, dropped into our species alone. It looks a lot more like the emotional cost of being deeply, dependently social. The stronger the bond an animal relies on for its own survival, the more its internal systems seem to react when that bond is suddenly severed. Elephants, orcas, chimpanzees, wolves, and even some corvids all share one underlying trait: long, complex relationships they genuinely depend on to live and to raise their young successfully. Which means grief probably isn't something evolution built as some strange accident or as a byproduct with no purpose. It may be something evolution built on purpose, in a manner of speaking, because losing a crucial relationship needed to feel costly enough internally to actually change future behavior. An animal that becomes more cautious, more attentive to the surviving members of its group, more careful about protecting the bonds it has left after a loss, may simply survive better than one that shrugs off every death without consequence. There's an even stranger layer to this. Researchers studying crows have found that after witnessing a dead member of their own species, crows will remember the location for a surprisingly long time, and in some experimental setups, they'll treat humans seen near a dead crow with heightened suspicion for weeks, even months afterward. That's not mourning exactly. It's something closer to threat assessment, wired directly to the memory of death. It suggests these funeral gatherings may serve a dual purpose, something that looks emotional on the surface, layered directly on top of a very practical survival function, learning where danger has recently been. So the twist isn't that only humans have real grief while animals fake it, and it's also not the opposite extreme that every species mourns exactly the way we do. It's that grief-like behavior appears to scale directly with social complexity, showing up strongest in exactly the species that depend most heavily on their relationships to survive, and it likely serves more than one function at once, wrapped together inside a single behavior. How do you explain a funeral with no human around? You don't explain it as a funeral in the full human sense, with symbolic ritual, spoken language, or explicit beliefs about an afterlife. Nothing in the current evidence supports that level of abstract thought in any other species studied so far. But you also can't wave the behavior away as meaningless, empty instinct, because for the most socially complex species, the evidence simply doesn't support that explanation either. What you're actually looking at, across the animal kingdom, is a spectrum. On one end sit simple chemical triggers, like ants automatically clearing corpses, and even living ants coated in the wrong chemical, without any awareness of death required at all. Slightly further along, you find practical survival responses, like crows learning to avoid locations and individuals associated with death. And at the far end of that same spectrum sit elephants returning again and again to touch the bones of their own dead, orcas carrying their dead for over 2 weeks across 1,000 miles of ocean, and chimpanzees falling silent, grooming a body one final time, and quietly avoiding the exact place where a companion died. Death, for the vast majority of animals, isn't something they philosophize about, and it never will be. But for the species that live the most complex, most interdependent social lives on Earth, the evidence now strongly suggests that death is something that clearly registers inside them, and something that visibly, measurably costs them, in behavior that lasts days, weeks, or in Tahlequah's case, more than 2 straight weeks without pause. Ending. But answering that question honestly opens up a much stranger, much larger one. If grief-like behavior evolved specifically because certain animals depend on deep, lasting bonds to survive, then what does that say about all the animals we've never studied closely enough to actually know? Deep-sea whales that spend their entire lives in darkness researchers almost never observe directly. Species quietly going extinct before we've even had the chance to document how they live day to day, let alone how or whether they mourn. Entirely possible we're losing entire capacities for grief across this planet that we never even knew existed. Bonds, and the losses of those bonds, playing out in silence, far from any camera or researcher, forever. If you find these kinds of questions about the hidden emotional lives of animals as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of this world worth uncovering.